Hello, everyone coming in.
Hello.
Good evening. We're going to make sure everybody is getting in, and then we will get started in just a few seconds. You are welcome to take yourselves off of, or to put on your camera. Later on, we'll invite you to unmute. But for now, we can all stay muted just to make sure we don't have any back noises. Okay. I think I'm going to get us started.
Yes, hello. Hello and welcome, everyone.
All right, so hello everyone. Good evening. My name is Sophie Don. I'm the Associate Director of the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. And I'm so pleased to see so many familiar faces or familiar names. Um, and
Aquaman?
oh, hello.
Yeah, he's
If,
on.
if we can have everybody remain on mute just while we do our presentation, and then we'll ask you to unmute later on. Um, Again, it's wonderful to see all these familiar names and familiar faces, and also a lot of new faces and names on this call. With everybody ready to light your candles in honor of those 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. I'd like to welcome you all to this program. There are people on this call from our Philadelphia community, as well as joining us all the way from Idaho, from California, from Florida, from Alaska, North Carolina, a few other places. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, which began at sundown yesterday and ends at nightfall tonight, is a solemn occasion to reflect on the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. It's a time to honor and remember the millions of victims and to really reaffirm our commitment individually and as a community to combating anti-Semitism and all forms of systemic discrimination. This is our 6th virtual Yom HaShoah candle lighting, where we've come together to virtually light our candles and remember and reflect together. The yellow candle lighting has become a staple of our Yom HaShoah programming. It's a concise and very meaningful way to connect with members of our community across the country. And this Yom HaShoah is especially notable as we're now at the 80th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust. For the central part of our program tonight, we will be speaking to one member of our community, Rabbi Chana Leslie Glazer. Rabbi Glazer is the interim rabbi at Temple Brich Achim in King of Prussia, and she is also a proud 3G, a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. She will be speaking with the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation's Executive Director Eszter Kutas, who is also a grandchild of survivors. We will then we'll take some time to learn about Rabbi Glazer's family story and how it has shaped her life and practice as a rabbi. Then she will lead us in our candle lighting. So with that, I will turn it over to Eszter.
Thank you, Sophie. So again, my name is Eszter Kutas, and I'm the ED of the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. It's really a pleasure to see so many people joining us for this year after year. I am really honored to be joined by Rabbi Glazer. We've worked with the rabbi before and listened to her wisdom at previous events. And of recent, I have learned that Rabbi Glazer comes from a family of survivors, and her story was really, really unique to me because her grandparents and great-grandparents' story is very different from the ones that I typically hear. So I asked Rabbi Glazer to talk to us and share a little bit about her background. So I'm just going to get us going here, if that's okay with you, Rabbi Glazer. So as a descendant of survivors, could you share a little bit your grandparents and your great-grandparents' story during the Holocaust? It's particularly interesting to me that they are coming from a very, very small town where they were the only Jewish family in Germany, in a small town in Germany. So what I would like to know is, really their story and how you learned their stories and what was shared with you as a child and what did you find out and how later as an adult?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just really want to appreciate the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, Esther and Sophie, for the invitation. It is it's a true honor for me. I also just want to shout out to the members of my congregation who are on today from Temple B'Rithachim. This is our Holocaust Remembrance Program, so we're glad to have everybody who's with us. So I guess it is an unusual story. I've heard many survivors over the years, and this story sounds different for a number of reasons. It was Germany and not Eastern Europe. My grandparents, and you see their pictures there. My grandmother grew up in a little farming town called Oestinghausen, which is in central Germany, in the I guess close to East Germany, central Germany, and a small, sleepy little town. And they fled in the late 1930s, 1938, just before Kristallnacht, my grandmother and my grandfather, and that itself is an interesting story. But I grew up with them as my grandparents, and I knew some of what they'd been through. They didn't hide the fact that they came from Germany, and they did share a couple of stories, just a very few. And I was always looking for more information, but they weren't sharing much more. My grandfather especially, just very reticent. And for a series of reasons, I wound up going to Germany and living there as an exchange student because I really wanted to learn more about my background and learn German well enough that I could actually go back and visit her town, Oestinghausen, while people who knew them were still there. This is many years ago already. I was a high school senior. And so the people who knew the family were still alive. They were still there. And small town. So actually went there. And like I said, German was good enough to hear it all. They told me the story of what happened to my family, including the time when my grandparents were there, but also after they left. Nobody knew what happened after my grandparents fled. They tried to write letters, but they didn't get any answers back. And so my grandmother never knew what happened to her parents. So there's a picture of Oestinghausen. The picture on the right is what they call the quote, quote, Jewish quarter. It's maybe like 2 or 3 buildings. And there used to be, I think at its height, the Jewish community in Oestinghausen had a total of 10 Jewish families, 9 or 10, somewhere in there. And they came, as many Jews did, for economic opportunities in the farming areas. They really encouraged Jewish migration, and Jews were there for maybe about 100 years. After which, economic reasons and such, a lot of people moved to the United States, not just from that town, but Germany for sure. There was a vast migration. And so slowly but surely, my family, the Neukirchers, stayed there, and they dug in and they built that house that you see on the left-hand side and really invested in that community. And while other Jewish families were leaving, they pitched their tent and decided to stay. And so the story of what happens from there is about, what would happen in a German town if you really didn't have a Jewish population, a Jewish community, Jewish institutions. I mean, the synagogue had shut down at some point. There was really nothing left except for them. And they were pretty secular. Like, there was no Jewish observance that I could tell. They just were proud in their identity, and that was important to them. They didn't hide it at all. Everybody knew in the town that they were Jewish. So what was going to happen, when the Nazis came? And anyway, because I was in that town and talking to people, I actually got to hear stories. My grandparents, my my grandparents had fled, but my great-grandparents, that's Paul and Adele Neukircher, they were living in that house and they were running a general store and very involved in the town. My great-grandfather was in the volunteer fire department. I think he was fire chief for a short period of time. He was also in the town choir, so they loved music, and he was kind of a pillar of the community and helped people out in the community. I heard some really nice stories about that. And they, but after 1935, there started to be a lot of discouragement of doing business with Jews, and just, went downhill from there. They eventually had to let go of their business, surrender their business. And at some point, they also had to try to sell the home because they literally had nothing to live on when people stopped patronizing their business. And so they sold the home to one of the families in the town. And I'm not sure how much they bought it for or sold it for. The town claims it was a nice number, but we don't have any records of that. It's hard to tell. What I do know that happened is that the family that bought it turned it into a boarding house, turned it into an apartment building, boarding house. And upstairs, my great-grandparents got to live in the bottom quarter of the house. And upstairs from them literally lived two Nazis. So the rest of their lives, they spent living downstairs with no income, with these Nazis upstairs from them.
Was the community trying to help them, given that they've been living there for generations, running the general store?
Yeah. So it was interesting, getting to hear their stories about that, because obviously they'd had a lot of time to think about it. They'd had a long time to think about it. My grandparents had left in 38, and this was like, I don't know, 1988 when I was there. So it'd been 50 years with no connection with my family whatsoever. They didn't know what happened to them. So when I showed up, there was a lot of curiosity, but also a lot of interest in really telling those stories about here's what happened. And it kind of broke my heart, but it also just really kind of knocked me into a certain amount of consciousness about how hard it was for them. They were in this little town and everybody knew everybody, and everybody was in everybody else's business, and everybody knew my family, the Neukirchers. They were like right there in the middle of the town with the house and the store. And they said, we tried to do business with them, but we couldn't. We weren't allowed. We were afraid for our lives. And they said, at some point, my great-grandfather somehow got some coffee or some kind of like merchandise products that he could sell. And he was kind of selling behind the store, like a little street corner kind of situation, illegally. And people would kind of illegally kind of sneak back behind the house at night and like meet him there. So, and they were trying to do what they could, but at some point, even that got to be too dangerous. Again, I'm not sure how they lived with no income. That part did not get clarified for me. At least they were able to stay in the house. And they said, the townspeople said that the house was not destroyed in Kristallnacht, but that makes sense to me. If there were Nazis living upstairs, you're not going to burn that house down. So they made that as like, oh, it's such a big deal. We didn't burn down their house. I'm like, oh, all right. Okay. My great-grandfather was detained during Kristallnacht. He was one of the couple, whatever it was, tens of thousands of people across Germany, Jews who were detained for a couple of weeks as kind of a test balloon for later deportations. And the families there didn't really talk about that much, about how they viewed it. Didn't really talk about it at all. They were the ones who told me that he was detained, though, so I know that they were aware of it. More to tell, but maybe you have other questions.
Sure. So did you know when you were a child that your great-grandparents went through this? Or were most of the things that you have learned were the story of your grandparents who survived?
My grandparents talked about their family. My grandmother in particular, she was raised there in that house. She was really proud of her family. They were a proud family, and they had a lot to be grateful for. And they were also just, worked really hard to be part of the community, and they were just very well liked. There was I forget which member of my family, which generation it was, but I think it might have been Paul was actually elected to the town council several times. So he was quite popular. So I think from her, the stories that she told, she only had a couple really that she told about Germany, were really just a lot of it was kind of remembering good times, but then also being very confused about how that you could go from A to B. And she talked about how the family was decorated in World War One. My great grandfather Paul, he fought in World War One, and he was recognized as a war hero. I actually got to see his picture in the town hall. They had a little poster with all the veterans of World War One on it, and I saw his picture there. So she talked about how they were honored for World War One, and I know that story was meant to process some of her absolute confusion of how could it have gotten to this.
For sure. What happened after Krista met with your
Yeah,
great grandparents?
yeah. So again, somehow they lived to 1942 in that little house with the Nazis upstairs, and I visited the first time, and I did go back a second time, and I'm happy to talk about that too. The first time I went, though, they took me over to the firehouse, and they had a big ledger there with handwriting in it, and they showed me the ledger that showed the record of my great grandparents being deported, and it was 1942.
Where
And
were they deported to?
so at first they were deported to Theresienstadt
Mhm.
in the Czech Republic, and or what's now the Czech Republic. And it was kind of billed as like a, an elders retirement home for Jews. It
Yeah.
was, they made
Yeah.
it sound very cushy and nice. And my great grandparents apparently volunteered to go. And I'm not sure if they knew. I'm sure the whole town knew what was going down. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what their situation was with that. The Theresienstadt deportations were relatively early. Um, I do know after Theresienstadt, I think they were there about 6 months, and my great grandfather Paul, his brother, he had a brother, Uncle Alfred. My grandmother used to call him Uncle Alfred, and Uncle Alfred. There's stories about Uncle Alfred too, but he was also around. He also got deported to Theresienstadt, so I think they might have been there around the same time. But anyway, about 6 months later, they then got deported to a death camp. And their records in Yad Vashem, I looked them up in Yad Vashem, and the records in Yad Vashem indicate that they were killed there. So that was the end there. But as far as the town knew, all they knew was that they were deported in 1942, and that was it.
Yeah. So just for our community here, so Theresienstadt was a propaganda site. It was made look to the external world as a summer camp or a senior camp of some sorts. In reality, the conditions in these camps, in this particular camp, was quite horrible. But this was a site that was used as a propaganda to share with the rest of the world, to hide from the rest of the world that indeed this was a concentration camp and a ghetto. So just wanted to share that for clarity's sake. I know that when they were deported in 41, 42, nobody in the world really understood what was going on in Theresienstadt. That became unfortunately clear much later.
Yeah.
Please continue. Sorry.
Well, I did want to say that I went back twice. The first time, of course, blew my teenage mind open in many ways. Thinking about, what if that were me? How would I have handled that if that were me? Also, just listening to them and their excuses about how they couldn't help. I'm like, how big a town was this, and how hard could it have been? Like, could you not have hidden them somewhere? I had so many questions, you know.
Mhm.
But I was so in shock that I was actually sitting in my family homestead from, you know, generations back. My Neukirches went all the way back to the 1700s in that little town, right? It's a
Yes.
long, long time. And the fact that I'm sitting in that garden speaking in German, drinking the schnapps of this family that took over the home from my great grandparents, it was just a very, very, it was just a very shocking thing. And it took me a long time to kind of process that. But I had so many questions about, you know, why couldn't they? Why couldn't they have done something? Apparently, in the end, the day that they were deported to Theresienstadt, someone showed up with like a little half a sandwich, and they gave it to they gave it to the guy who was crippled from the war, and disabled and kind of walking on a cane, and because they figured if he was trying to help them that they wouldn't deport him. You're going to deport a guy on a cane anyway. So they sent him out with this little half a sandwich. And I'm like, really? Half a sandwich? It's like the best y'all could do. But so that really stuck with me. And then I went back again in 2011. There was a trip that I took with an interfaith organization that went to Auschwitz, and then also to Berlin. And after the trip was over, I went back to Erstinghausen many years later. And I got to meet more people there who actually knew more about the history, who'd researched the history. They wrote this amazing, huge coffee table book. It was really important to the generation of the perpetrators in that town. It was really important to the children of the perpetrators uh, that they clear up what happened. There were all these narratives about like, oh, we didn't know, or you know, we took care of the Jews that were there. And there's this one engineer who, upon his retirement, made it his job to go and interview everybody in the town who was around during World War II and talk to them about what they did and their responsibility, which I mean in itself is amazing. He created this book, dedicated his life to it, clearly. He was really super excited to see me because he never knew what happened to my grandparents. We
Mhm.
didn't know what happened to my great grandparents, but he didn't know what happened to my grandparents. So when I showed up, he was like, "Oh, wow, really excited." And he was the one who took the picture that you saw of me before, where I was there at the crossroads, and um, and I stayed in his home for a couple days with his wife, and you know he took me around, and we visited some places, and we talked a lot. I was able to share with him my great grandparents when they came to the United States. They came semi legally, not fully legally. They didn't have a real actual sponsor. They've kind of faked that part of their visa application, so they weren't it wasn't technically fully legal. But they when they got to the United States, uh, they worked as best they could, given they were speaking a foreign language and different experience and such. And of course, that time wasn't especially friendly to any kind of immigrants at that point. But at some point, Germany offered what it called Wiedergutmachung, which is recompensation to the survivors of the Holocaust. If you could prove that you were a survivor and you had a business that was appropriated by the Nazis, that they would receive reconciliation reparations. Reparations, that's the right word for it. So my grandfather and grandmother had, you know, basically lived through poverty and um, totally, absolutely terrified after the experience that they survived. And so they saved every penny they possibly could, including a lot of the Wiedergutmachung that they received.
Mhm.
And upon my grandfather's death, my sister and I inherited a chunk of it, and that was whatever was left at that point. And I used that to pay for rabbinical school. And I shared that with, with this gentleman who'd done all the work on that book. And he just started crying.
Yeah, it is indeed very touching how life comes full circle in this way in your story. It's really wonderful that they were able to support you this way, you know?
Well, and also by coming there and by telling him that story and by letting him know,
Mhm.
how my family survived and how it ended up, it was like he finally had some closure too, because he talked to every single person he could track down in that little town. There was no avoiding this guy. He's really funny. But you know, there was this piece that he was missing. And so I think I was able to finally give him some peace and some closure as well. And I was really grateful for that because I could tell how much he cared and how important it was to him that people, that people come clean. In the big cities in Germany, they did a lot of work on raising consciousness about Germany's responsibility in the Holocaust, as well as individual responsibility. But back in the agricultural hinterlands, like it's just not something that they cared about, worked on. It didn't reach there really. So this one gentleman, he forced it on them. And it was very powerful. And I came right towards the end of that whole period, that whole stage. So it was a very powerful experience, not just knowing their stories, the intergenerational stories, and learning about their history is very powerful, but also being able to be part of that history myself.
Absolutely.
That's very unusual, right? I think with most survivor stories, like there is no going back for the most part. And even if you do, it's not really like you can find out much. So I just consider myself really fortunate. And so I do try to tell that piece of the story because I feel like it's also really important to look at how they made, how they responded to all of it in future generations and how they took responsibility themselves. It was a very powerful example, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Actually, generally held that Germany, of all the European countries, did the best job for generations to reckon with their history, both on an educational, kind of a national educational level, as well as on individual levels and on smaller communities. But how wonderful it is that just your own staff were able to provide disclosure for this gentleman who really took it up on himself to find those impossible answers for
Yeah,
the impossible questions.
yeah.
Uh,
Single-handedly,
yeah,
right? People used to
yeah,
roll their eyes when they talked about him. He was just like so dedicated to this.
for sure. Yeah, I'm sure that a lot of people were quite uncomfortable with his questions. Nevertheless, it's that discomfort zone that all of us need to live in to face ourselves. Um, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how growing up in a family of survivors and the loss that your family suffered inspired you in your Jewish identity and in particular in becoming a rabbi.
Yeah. So, I think my family is my parents an interfaith family, so they're an interfaith couple,
Mhm.
which wasn't really celebrated by anybody in the decade I was growing up. That was just not it's just not a thing like it is today. It was
Mhm.
a lot of difficulty actually. And so that actually impacted my Jewish identity, I think, more than the history. Um, when I did learn German and when I did go to Germany, though, that's kind of when everything blew open. And of course, I knew their stories, like I said, the ones that they were willing to share with me.
Mhm.
I learned a lot more stories actually while I was in Germany. But anyway, the point is that while I was there in Germany, not only was I learning German, not only was I doing the you know, getting ready to go to this place because I said, whatever I'm going to do this year, I'm going to go to that place. I'm going to go visit Erstinghausen, one way or the other, I'm going. And so preparing for all that, but also just living in Germany in the late 80s, um, they were just starting to really like acknowledge the Holocaust at that point in time. So I would talk to people and they'd be like, "Oh, okay. So are you Christian or are you Protestant?" are you Catholic or you Protestant? And I'd be like, well, neither. And kind of they'd get this like big, look on their face. These were kids at school, right? I was in high school. So the kids would ask, they're like, okay, so are you Catholic or Protestant? Like something that they probably asked everybody who was new. Um, and I'd say neither. And they were like, oh, like any answer from here is going to be trouble. So, just watching like the color drain out of their faces, it was hard. And, my coloring and such, I don't really look like most Germans did at that time, at least in the place where I was living. And so I was already like stood out a little bit. They thought I was a foreign immigrant family from a foreign immigrant family from Turkey. And so I got to like experience that prejudice in my own body, right? Um, there was a time that year I was living in Germany where there was a guy in the square who saw me walking by and did like a Nazi salute.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute, how do you know?
Yeah.
But it was, again, because of the body that I was there with. And so, that was I I felt very traumatized by being Jewish. And I kind of wished for a while, especially, that I could leave it behind. Um, I actually tried going to a Catholic church while I was there in Germany. Some of my school buddies went to this very cool Catholic church, so I tried going to the Catholic church, but I didn't last very long. It just wasn't right. It wasn't me. Even though there are Catholics in my family, as I mentioned, it's an interfaith family, but it just wasn't me. I couldn't do it, and I realized, like it or not, I'm Jewish. I can't get around that. And so after I went to Erstinghausen, it all felt very different, because I realized like I'm all they've got right now. My mom died when I was 16. So, like I was really the one who was carrying the story. And I was really the one who cared. I took pictures of their house when I went in 88, and I brought back pictures back to my grandmother, and I said, I found out what happened, right? I found out what happened to your family. And I have pictures, do you want to see the pictures? And of course, for her, that was very, very hard. Very, very hard. Yeah. So, in terms of my identity, I realized like, wow, it's a burden. However, the story of their survival and the story of who they were, who my great grandparents were, despite all the oppression, despite all the awful stuff, I found very inspiring and absolutely like a source of resilience for difficult times today. And knowing that I come from that history and that background was important. It was an important part of my sense of if I'm going to be Jewish, I might as well be Jewish this way. And becoming a rabbi came much later in life. In my 30s, really was kind of when I made that discovery that I wanted to try that path and pursue that path. But I was very, very clear from the start that I was kind of dedicating that to them, in a lot of ways, to my mom, but also to my grandparents and to my great grandparents. When I went back in 2011, there was another family who had bought the house. So this one family owned it the whole time, the ones that made it a boarding house. And then this other family took it and bought it later. And they renovated the whole place like a museum. Like they researched the architecture of the time and they found all of this. They spent a lot of money restoring it to its original, to its original state as much as they could. And they were very proud to show me the house. They took me all around the house and they're like, we want you to know that we have cared for this like a museum. And they said there's just this one room really that we haven't been able to do anything with, and it's the attic. And they took me up to the attic. And the attic was full of like old agricultural stuff, like I don't know, wheels and pulleys. And you could tell it was like that's where the grain was stored. So these big, massive pulleys and stuff. And you could tell it hadn't been touched. No one had touched it. No one had touched it. And I just felt I felt my family there, you know. I felt my great grandparents there, their presence there. And it's emotional. I told them I'm not going to let anybody forget you.
Yeah. And you're just doing that. So thank you so much for sharing their story.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really a unique story for sure. And I really applaud you for, as a teenager and then as an adult, to digging deeper and trying to understand your own heritage more and not leaving that heritage behind despite the discomfort and burden that has affected you as you were growing up. I'm going to ask everybody, so thanks again for sharing your story, Rabbi Glazer. I'm going
Thank
to
you.
ask everyone to turn their camera on, please, if you can. And then Sophie is going to lead us in lighting our candles.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Rabbi Glazer. So at this time, I'm going to ask you all to pick up your candle. And if you received one from us, take a look at the name that's on it. If you're joining with a candle of your own, please think of someone. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a family friend, maybe it's someone who you've read about or who you've heard the story of, but somebody who perished in the Holocaust. And let us remember that each of these names is just one of millions. And as we think about these names, the birth dates, the places of birth, the places of murder that you have written on those candles that you received from us, let us remember that each of those names also represents a full life unlived. There's a saying in Judaism that whoever saves a life saves the world entire, which I think is just a beautiful saying. But it really emphasizes the enormity of each of these losses. Each loss was an entire world. So with this in mind, we're going to ask you to light your candles. And as you do, feel free to say the name or the names of the people that are either on the candle or that you are thinking about. Feel free to unmute briefly to say that. And I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Glazer to lead us in a song and prayer.
Just got on the candle lit here. So as we light these candles, let us vow never to forget the lives, all the people who are symbolized in these flames. They were tortured and brutalized, and their lives were taken in cruelty. May we be inspired to learn more about our 6 million brothers and sisters as individuals and also their communities. May we remember not only the sadness of their deaths, but also the splendor of their lives. And may the memory of their lives inspire us to hallow our own lives and to live more meaningful Jewish lives so that we may help ensure that part of who they were shall endure forever. And I'm going to lead us now in the memorial prayer, El Male Rachamim. Members of my congregation will know this one because it's one that I share at Yizkor and other moments where we're remembering our deceased. El Male Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hametzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tachorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmot Kol Shehiskarnu Hayom, Shehalchu Leolamam, B'Gan Eden Teher Menuchatam, Ana Bal Harachamim Hastirem, בסתר כנפיך לעולמי, וצרור, בצרור החיים, את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו בשלום המשכבם, ונאמר Amen. O merciful one, grant perfect rest, and may our loved ones be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. May Adonai be their portion. May they be sheltered under God's wings and live in the Garden of Eden. And may they rest in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Glazer. Thank you for everyone for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi Glazer, so much for your presence this evening and for sharing your story. And thank you, Esther, for leading this conversation. As we close our program, I'd like to invite those of you who are in the area to join us for our in-person Yom HaShoah commemoration, which will be taking place at our Horowitz-Wasserman Holocaust Memorial Plaza in Center City, Philadelphia. It will be this Sunday, April 27th at 2 p.m. I'd also recommend that if you have not done so already, to take a look at Yad Vashem's database of names. You'll find that link in any of the reminder emails that you received to learn a little bit more about the individual that's named on your candle. And as your candles are burning, we invite you to post a photo of it if you would like, and its accompanying placard on social media so that we can kind of join in community together again in this virtual space. And you can use the hashtags Yellow Candle and Philly Remembers so that we can all link these pictures as our community in remembrance. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Please enjoy this wonderful weather, maybe take a walk, and have a really safe and good evening. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.